Awesome, it's great to be with all of you today. Thanks for the intro, John. Intros are always a little bit awkward, right? There's all sorts of things that you, I literally need to know that about you. But I just want to get the elephant out of the room for those of you that have attention to detail, because if there's any of you that are interested in operations today, you probably have quite a detailed eye. So in getting ready for this morning, I packed my clothes out last night because I have a toddler and often he ends up in my bed, and I was going to end up getting up really early to get ready for coming through, and I didn't want to wake him because then my husband's there for chaos. So I thought about it, was like, hang on, don't wear your go-to outfit, because I've seen photographs of that are being circulated in the Common Ground or the Business Code networks. So I chose something else. And then as I was driving here, I realized it's exactly the same outfit I wore in the video that you guys chose. So I promise I have more than 2 outfits. Anyway, so as Jonathan said, when he asked me to speak in operations, I was like, sure, that feels like the short straw. But it's like, of the 3 of the Praxis model, that's like the one that feels the most boring. But as I started processing it, I think I realized that there's actually, it was almost like a divine request from Jonathan, or God had deposited it in his heart to ask me to do it, because it's actually something I'm really passionate about. I think I just never really connected the fact that it's operations. So whenever I lead teams, one of the things that I've been the most passionate about is trying to see how you can get your team to flourish the most, and how we can truly live out the things that we say. And so, just as a little bit of background, as Jonathan said, I was with Mergon for many, many years. So I was with Mergon for 14 years, and so I joined when we were a team of 10. And by the time we spun out, we went through a stage where we were up at about 65. And so watching the progression and the changes and the shifts in the organization was super fascinating. And in the early days, when we were a small team of 10, it was really easy. Everybody was touching the vision casters, the heart, the posture, the motivation, the intent was all coming through easily because they were right at the coalface with us. But as Mergon started to grow, there was middle management and then like multiple layers of people in the organization. And so what starts happening is that your vision casters, or people that want that deep motivation and that deep vision, aren't actually touching at the coalface anymore. And so we started to find that there was just different values that were sort of showing, not bad ones, but just slightly different to what I would have anticipated. Or there were looking grumblings. There was nothing sad, but they were a little grumbly about, we say this, but I'm experiencing this. And as part of the leadership team, we thought, come on, we know that actually we're living these things out. But I started to realize that it was an operational thing. That's we're as leaders are close to the operations, we often make sure that the values and things get lived out through the operations. And as we start separating ourselves from it, because we have to, because of growth, how do we intentionally still keep a lot of that motivation, that intention in our operations? Because something I learned, and many of you might know this already, it is a new learning to me, about 7 years ago, was that operations actually fundamentally shapes your culture. So, don't worry, I'll let you know where. So just to rewind and go back to the sort of slide, the picture that Praxis has, the model that Praxis has. When I was busy reflecting on this, I started to realize that actually God really has called me to live in that zone of operations. And so if you could put that slide up for me. Next one. Thanks. You'll see that you go through leadership, and as a leader, we often think about our motivation. We think about how we're showing up. We're thinking about hopefully dying to self. And so there's a lot, and we've heard about that. Then we spend a lot of time in the intention block, where it's about our vision. Like, what is it that God has called us to? How is this going to look from a strategy perspective? So there's a huge amount of intent, but then the embodiment. And I called it the embodiment because I really do believe that all of these other things can just be great concepts, unless we embody them in real life. And so I think our operations and the growing conviction I've had over the years is that operations is the true embodiment of all the rest. And if we aren't embodying it, then all of that doesn't really matter what we think if we're not living it out actively. So if you go back to the slide above, I termed our talk for today operations, where our faith becomes visible. Because I really do believe that that is where our faith becomes visible. And just to sort of relay a story from the other day, I was sitting within Zawadi. We have these groups, peer accountability groups, or discipleship, marketplace discipleship groups that meet monthly. We spend 4 hours together, deep dive with one another, and talk through everything from business to life to spirituality to sort of whole life stuff with high accountability. And I was sitting chatting to one of the ladies in the council group that I'm a part of, and she was just, because I run Zawadi and I deal with Christian business leaders, she was saying to me, sure, but I find that Christians, they're quite hard to work with. Like in the marketplace, they're like hard. So she works a lot with bringing people back into the marketplace after they've had some kind of injury. And just saying that our Christian clients often are the toughest because everybody says the right things, but when you're trying to practically implement it, there's like a whole bunch of unsaid things that you bump up against because nobody wants to tell you those things because they're not the right things to say. And so I found that fascinating listening to that, and it started unpacking multiple conversations in my head that I've had over the years of people that have said similar things. And so if you can go 2 slides down, these are some of the things that I've had people say to me in various contexts, and there's a lot more. I found more honesty in a secular work context. I've experienced more respect and fairness working for non-believers. I'd rather work where integrity is real. That's rough. And so, in preparing for this, I started to think it through and go, well, why? Why? I mean, when you're working for people that don't believe, even if they have a good moral compass, why are people finding that space more fruitful or easier to work in than they are when they're within a company where there's a Christian leading it, or even if the company has a Christian ethos? And so it led me to realize or come to the conclusion that there's one word that I think it boils down to, and that's in-congruence. I think what happens is that our non-believing brothers and sisters are, what you see is what you get. Like, I'm about money, so know that I'm going to squeeze you. I'm going to squeeze every ounce of you because I'm about the bottom line, I'm about margins. And so when you are experiencing being squeezed through every last drop, you at least knew that that was what you were stepping into. But as believers, how much of the aspirations we have, which are good and right, and we feel like God has deposited in us, do we struggle to actually implement in our day-to-day? And how many people are sitting in this weird juxtaposition where they're going, they care about family, they care about my well-being, they care about the oppressed, they care about whatever it is, but my experience is not that. My experience is we're actually still about bottom line. Or my experience is that we still run things the way as everybody else does. And so I think it's that idea of something different, and it's almost that idea of I had a hope that it would be different, and it's not as different as I thought it would be. And so there's incongruence between our vision or what we're casting and the way that we're actively acting it. And so that is why I think I'm so passionate about this topic of operations, because this is where we really get to live it out. This is where we can actually try and get rid of this incongruence, or at least be honest about it. I think sometimes if we're just honest about it too, I think it'll help people. We know that we haven't quite got it, but we're at least trying. We're at least trying to do it instead of pretending or believing that we've got it sorted, and maybe we haven't yet. So I thought, there's quite a weighty place to start. So I thought, well, let's go back to Scripture. Let's first go see, does Scripture have operations in it? Let's go see what Bible says. And so I made a bit of a timeline that goes through a couple of characters. So the first is Noah. Noah got pretty much a blueprint downloaded. You've got a vision from God. This is what you're to do. These are the sizes. This is how long it's going to take for him to build something that would actually ultimately save his family, but also be what generations get built on in the future. Joseph was called in because the king had a dream, and Joseph interpreted it. And there were going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. And so the king said to him, you go and you figure out how we're going to store away these years of abundance so that we can provide to the people in the years of famine. That's operational. That's forward planning. That's future planning. That's creating a system that can actually predict or at least buffer some of what's going to come in the future. Moses and the tabernacle, again, very detailed instructions of exactly how things need to happen. Then we have Nehemiah. I mean, here comes governance, here comes contracts. He had to have letters from kings, he had to procure things, he had to sort of move through states and places that he normally would have been challenged to go through. He had to mobilize people to work together to complete something that would bring dignity back to a city. Solomon's temple, again, that was very detailed, to the point how this temple should be built. Jesus feeding the disciples feeding the 5,000. Okay? The disciples feeding the 5,000. Jesus got the disciples to actually put people in groups. So they had a structure, they had a system, they had a plan, where there were all these groups set out, and then they went with the baskets and started feeding them. And obviously it just kept the abundance kept coming. And then the last one is in Acts, where the apostles, there's many more, the last one I'm going to speak about, is in Acts where the apostles realize that there's people moaning, grumbling that the widows aren't getting food. And are saying that they're not being treated the same way as the Hebrew Jews. And so what they do is they appoint deacons. They appoint deacons to actually serve the widows and to make sure that the widows are getting food. And so that's, again, bringing in a structure of resource, of people, to be able to serve people. And so I have a look at this. There's something about a stewardship in there. There's something about a stirring with people. There's something about a glorifying God in it. There's something about God's heart posture toward his people and toward the glory of who he is in all of what operations has to capture it. You can go to the next slide. So from that I take it that operations is the stewardship of people. I love that word stewardship. That stewardship is not about ownership. That it's not something we own. And if I think about those examples, what was really fascinating to me as I pondered on this was that most of those people had one moment of vision within these big projects. It was like God downloaded, this is what the ark should look like. And then from there, it actually was all about obedience and just implement, execution. If you think about Joseph, there was this dream, actually, and then the king handed this over to him as someone that could be a vision carrier to go and execute on it. And then he executed. So there's a huge part where there's a small role that happens where there's this vision that we get. And then there's a long season of obedience. Nehemiah's heart broke for the city. But what happened was he had years and years and years and years of obediently executing to be able to bring about the restoration, the dignity of the city. So if we think about this word stewardship, it's actually us realizing that this isn't ours. And I think we've all heard talks and sermons around stewardship versus ownership. and how important that concept is for us as believers. That we don't think that because we've started this business, we own it. It's ours. These people are ours. These resources are ours. That actually we realize that we are called to steward them as if they are somebody else's, that they are God's. So we are called to steward people the same as we would steward somebody else's son or daughter. To steward processes in a way that unlocks the flourishing. To steward resources in a way that we are happy to account for the way that we've stewarded them, being it time, money, influence, whatever resources you want to talk about, that we are stewarding it in a way that we are happy to report back to our ultimate CEO, which is God. But deliver these things, and it's all about delivering value in a way that restores, multiplies, and blesses. And I love those words around what is value and what kind of value should we be creating. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But just from looking at some of the examples in the Bible, there's something around stewardship that we should really be thinking through when it comes to our operations. So, as part of Sawani's, we have sort of course material and things, and we went on this long journey of going, well, how do we help not just think about things, but actually start putting things into practice? And so we had a whole group of business leaders and theologians from across the continent working on something that helps us think about the theology of it behind taking action. And so we've got this framework, if you want to call it. We call it the DBR, which is design, distortion, and redemption. And so we often take people through, this process, and we actually just recently did it in May. We got together a group of investors who are investing on the African continent and are wanting to figure out how do we better invest here, what is going to unlock the flourishing of our continent, how do we invest differently. And so we spent a day and a half together with 25 different investors from West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa going, what is God's original design for investing? Where are the distortions that exist in the investing landscape? And what can we do with the influence we have, with the roles that we have, and with the connections and networks that we have? How do we actually bring restoration or redemption into this? And so, what? One. So one more. Thank you. And so the whole yellow arc there is all about how do we actually start bringing that or closing the gap, that sits between design and distortion. How do we close this gap or minimize this gap? We'll never fully close it because that'll happen on the other side of eternity. But how do we actually start pulling this gap so that it's closer and closer to God's original design? And the way we do that is through redemptive action. The way we do that is by actually living things out differently to the way that the world is living them out. So I thought to go back and think through some of the operations that have, or the operational practices, I suppose, that have actually been birthed over the last couple of centuries. And to look at, well, some of these things, actually most things, human development generally has God's design inculcated into it, because we generally design and build to solve problems. We generally design and build to enable better flourishing, but often we accidentally inculcate brokenness into it too. And so if we go and have a look at industrialization, where things were, there was the division of labor, we had the factory system. This was amazing because it actually allowed people to be able to access things that they wouldn't normally be able to access. Textiles were now affordable and accessible. Food products were easier to come by. And so this was great because it reduced costs. The second thing was mass production. So Henry Ford was part of that, where they started to standardize things. They started to measure productivity. It was about outputs and sort of the movement of a production line. And so it was great. It transformed living standards. People could get cars, and there weren't these total bespoke things that only a few would have in their hands, because the moment you can mass produce, you can lower the costs and all people can have them in their homes. So actually, whole sort of society's way of living was being transformed because of this mass production. Quality and lean thinking. Great, it's looking at how do we eliminate waste, and often it was eliminating waste that was going to benefit the consumer, even better. The next one is globalization and also integration between systems and organizations. Amazing, because it gave us access to wider markets. It gave us access to opportunities that were beyond our own borders. And the last one, digital and agile operations. We've already started seeing it with AI, with big data crunching that's happening, that we can start solving problems much quicker. And a whole host of other things that come with that kind of development when it comes to operations. And so if we have a look at that, I think that speaks a little bit to that definition that I gave you around stewardship, which is stewarding processes, resources to deliver value that is going to actually restore, multiply, and bless. People are gaining access. People are able to afford things. People are able to have more time. People can problem solve quicker. Those are amazing. But now let's look at the flip side. If we look at some of the distortions, some of the things that maybe didn't help. In industrialization, you have a dehumanizing. Things became monotonous, unsafe, purposeless. If we look at mass production, it reduced workers to a time and motion. So how much can you do in so much time? And people were literally made numbers. Eliminating waste, quality and lean thinking, people started to relentlessly cut costs. To the point where there were layoffs and all sorts of crazy things. Globalizing and being integrated is amazing. But what it did do is it created these complex supply chains where you could hide exploitation. Nobody would ask you about exploitation that was happening in the system. And in the digital age, I think we're still seeing some of the negatives, because so often we openly understand the negatives in hindsight. But there's a lot of plain things being obsolete, obsolescence, I think the word is. Because things are changing so quickly that you're actually planning that this will only be around for a short while, which is going to increase waste. And the second thing is there's such a high rate of change that people may start struggling to keep up with this change, and actually burnout can become even more prevalent. And so you can see here, if we think about that structure that I gave you, there's design, there's God's original design that you can see in the Bible. There's nothing wrong with human development and creating additional flourishing in the system aligned with God's principles. But then we accidentally bring in brokenness. We accidentally start bringing in things that actually start shifting the definition. And so what I went to do when I was preparing is I decided to go back to some of my MBA notes and look at the whole module and operations. And I was like, let's see what the definitions were again, okay? And it was fascinating to see that all it covered was systems and processes, pretty much. And sort of a very industrialized kind of thinking, or very sort of the purest form of operations, if you want to call it that. And the definition focused on a very different word. And so the definition was to efficiently manage the processes that create and deliver goods or services to customers. And now there's nothing wrong with efficiency. But if efficiency becomes the only thing or the key thing that drives us, it's a very different motivator to stewardship. They both want to create value, but value that is only created out of a space of efficiency may start getting distorted. But value that is being created out of a place of stewardship, where we understand that all things in the system need to be stewarded, actually bring the beauty into the operations. So if we have a look back at this design and distortion, I think it's clear that we all know that there is a gap, right? There's a gap that we all experience. I think we all face it every single day. I know we just spun out of Mogon, we spun out in January, and there's a whole bunch of systems and processes that we're busy implementing because all of our stuff used to be fully integrated into the Mogon systems, and so we're rebuilding all of our systems because now we're lending hand. And so what's been really interesting is at the same time our business model shifted from everything being for free to actually becoming a social enterprise. And it's been interesting to watch as we started implementing new processes that my team has never had before. I'm watching how this is starting to shift some culture. And luckily, we have a really good culture of conversation and challenge and bringing things up that are sitting uncomfortably within the team. But things like starting to have targets of what you're wanting to, of what you're wanting to attain in certain regions, or having price points on, like, this is what these things cost, are fundamentally challenging some people's, like, the deep-seated culture, where I can see people are going, okay, so does this mean that we just sell at all costs? Like, absolutely not. That's not what we're here for. We're here to equip and empower business leaders. We're not here just to make money. We're not going to make money. We're not making profit margins. We're just covering up our sort of costs. And so going back to it, we're going, no, we have to keep readdressing our culture, because the moment we implement new systems, how do we stop the team from actually kicking over into some of the unhelpful things that the operation starts putting in place, where we're not about actually driving sales at all costs, but we're actually there to serve. We're actually about service and finding the people that could benefit from your service. And that's our motivation, not just creating the money. Or things like just if we're asking people now to pay and we're starting to think about what kind of self-generated income we're making, I can see that it's trickling down into people's thought processes around, what does that mean for me as a team member? Like, do I have security? Is there a financial side now where you're starting to, like, evaluate me on a financial scale on, am I too expensive? Am I not too expensive? Am I valuable enough? And so those are interesting things, and those are just assumptions that are starting to creep into people's minds because they're seeing new things that we're busy with, new operational things that are coming into play, and that's creating thought patterns around things where they're going, hang on, I need to stop questioning because I didn't question before. And so we're doing the hard work to try and address that, but this gap, I experience very much so, and I definitely don't have all the answers around it. And so there's a bit of a framework that I put together that I feel like is something that can help guide us and is helping guide me in some of this process. And it's thinking through 3 different tensions that we're constantly having to navigate and balance when it comes to operations. So the first one is around a story. God's intent is always around shalom. He wants to see things in shalom. He wants to see things in wholeness. And so there's something around operations where we're constantly looking to restore. And even if it's a preemptive restoration. So for example, governance. The other day we had an example, we've been putting a lot of new governance measures in place because of our spin-out. And there were some conversations with the board where people were saying, do we really have to put all these clauses in? And one of our board members said that this is so that we have the fight before the fight, when there's no emotion or sort of negative feelings in the conversation. And about 3 weeks later, after it all had been signed off, we actually had something that came up at a board level, and we luckily had a fantastic process to follow that was in our board charter that we could go through that totally diffused the situation and actually has brought us to an even more beautiful and probably more redemptive place than we ever would have been in. But if we didn't have that structure in place, it would have gotten messy because it was, there's relationships, there's emotions, there's all sorts of things at play that really could go awry if we aren't diligent in actually being intentional about thinking through the things where we actually want to make sure that we have things in place so that it can be restorative in the way that we handle them, and also look for improvement. Look for ways that we are not, there's brokenness, there's something that can actually be better. The second tension is around growth for multiplication, which is also biblical. Think about the talents. God wants the talents to, the service to multiply their talents. Another thing around the talents is Jesus asks us to be pretty fruitful and multiply. And so there's a natural desire and trajectory of business to grow. And so there's something about growth that we desire. We want to see people grow. We want to see capacity in our business grow. We want to see more people serve. We have big visions. And that tension needs to be balanced with some of the things that have injustice made. And how do we make sure that we're not re-emphasizing injustice with scale, but we haven't dealt with some of the restoration stuff? And then the last bubble is around blessing. And the blessing is prioritizing human dignity, or actually thinking about enriching people's lives. Let's not get the bare minimum. Let's be different to what the world does in the way that you structure operations. That we're not trying to squeeze every last iota out of something, but that there's always a little bit of space to enrich. Enrich our people, enrich our customers, enrich our board even, enrich our stakeholders, our people in our supply chain. And that doesn't always mean financial. So when you hear enrich, it can sound a little bit dodgy. But what I'm trying to say is, how do we think beyond? How do we think beyond just the bare minimum? So as you can see, these three things actually sit almost in tension with one another, because when you restore things, it can sometimes slow stuff down. When you find something is breaking in the system, if you have to go and rebuild your process, or you've realized that you have a corrupt supplier, there's exploitation in your system, it's going to take a while to find someone else. And so sometimes it feels like a massive sacrifice for your business to actually go and do the hard work of restoration. The second part is multiplication. Multiplication, driving scale, can sometimes actually get us so scale-focused that we can actually start becoming all about efficiencies, we can become all about the bottom line, and so we can actually start abusing in other areas and lose focus of the whole view. And then lastly, blessing can sometimes lead to costly decisions. And so there's a balance that we need to do between these three. We're not always going to be able to just pull on one. That actually it's considering all three aspects of these when you're busy thinking through different aspects of operations. So enough about the theory, let's go to some practical examples. So the first one is a company called Butternut. So when we moved down to Stellenbosch, they were in the launch lab, which is a little incubator, or the university's incubator at Stellenbosch. And they had a little office. They just started. It was all very exciting. We spent a lot of time with I think there were like 3 people in the team, the CEO, the marketing manager, and somebody that was heading up the production that had been outsourced. And so their business has grown and flourished. The CEO is a believer, he loves the Lord. And we were chatting to him the other day, and what I really loved was he's found something that's broken. And he said what he realized in his journey is that he could do really well through oat milk. So they started doing oat milk, they're not just tree nut spreads, which is where they started. But he came across information that about, actually over 50% of the African population, African continent, the African population suffers with lactose intolerance. Same as if you ask, or if you look in stats, Asian people often have a specific gene that isn't present in their genetic code that doesn't metabolize alcohol. I don't know if you know that. And the same thing with Africa. There's parts of the African genome that often has a part in the genetic code that isn't there that would normally process milk. And so many people are lactose intolerant, which is something that we don't really talk about and nobody really thinks about. Everybody still drinks milk, right? Everybody has cows and just goes about life functioning with inflammation in their bodies. And so his deep desire was, well, how do we actually provide milk to people that are lactose intolerant, that is a milk alternative? And so what did he do? He started looking at his product and service design. So he went back. They used to have these really cute round bottles, very distinctive, great for marketing. Everybody knew it was Butternut in those bottles. But they went and had a look, and they found suppliers that could do high quality packaging still, but in the box format. And he was able to say through the way that it gets packaged, through the way that you distribute it, so you can fit more bottles in a not a lorry, what do you call it? Truck. If they package in squares rather than round, So there's a whole bunch of places within his supply chain that he was able to save costs. And so what he ended up doing is managing to save 10 rand per litre. And that's a lot. 10 rand per litre just by changing his packaging. And so what he did, instead of just going, that's fantastic, I'm going to get 10 rand more a bottle and my profits is like sky high. They're already a profitable business. And so this saving in cost, he's now started an alternate brand that has a different name to it, that is being sold to your lower LSM markets, and it is being pushed into spaza shops and all sorts of places where the consumer has a lower price point that they would pay for nut milk. And so he is actively trying to bring the price point down of this nut milk to make it attainable for people that wouldn't normally be able to afford something like nut milk, which is currently a premium product. It's currently something that only the affluent would generally be able to partake in. And so that's exceptionally exciting. What this also does is people might go, okay, you're not going to grow, but you're not going to grow, you're just losing profit share. But he's actually accessing a whole new market. Now, if you think about Africa, I mean, the sky's the limit if you're able to get into an absolutely new market at a price point that is attainable. But lastly, around blessing, we'd be tempted to give a market that pays less a substandard product, something that maybe doesn't taste as nice, or the packaging doesn't look as good, or something like that. But this is exactly the same product that you and I will go and pick up at Pick and Pay or Spar. It's exactly the same quality-wise that is going into a different market that is paying a much lower price point. Because why shouldn't we enrich people with milk products that taste good and are good for you when you are lactose intolerant, and this is actually going to be something that helps your health? And so I thought that is just a really beautiful story of somebody who's practically implemented something that is redemptive in the way that they actually design their product and actually think through the services they offer their customer base. The second example I have has to do with supply chain and procurement. So I met the guy that started this about 14, 15 years ago, and at that same time they were just starting off Property Point. And so again, there was a problem. There was two. One was a selfish problem and one was a justice problem. The selfish problem was BEE goals. In the built environment, people were struggling to get their BEE points. The reason why had to do with a broken system. In the built environment, there was a group of people that knew each other really well, had done a lot of work with one another, and generally worked together when it came to contracts. Most of these people were from a very similar cultural background, and so because of this sort of group of people that was generally used in the built environment, or this network of people that was generally used in the built environment, they were struggling to get BEE points because none of these contractors or suppliers were BEE compliant, so they were rolled up to growth points. They weren't necessary, they were struggling with being BEE compliant. And so there was this gap, there was this hole. And so Sean, who started Property Points, is exceptionally passionate about people's journeys and trajectories and just around creating opportunity or having access to opportunity. And so what he did was he started a program called Property Point. And so Property Point took young entrepreneurs who are either artisanal or architects, engineers, and brought them into this accelerator program where they did a few things. There was upskilling and all of those kinds of things that we find in an accelerator, but there was a huge aspect of cultural intelligence, which was fascinating, because they realized that there was a need to be able to relate and engage with the cultural grouping that currently monopolized this built environment, to be able to create trust, show that there's credibility, that my skills are good enough, that I'm just as good as anybody else in the space. And so there was a lot of that kind of training that they did. And slowly but surely, things have shifted, and there's a whole lot of people within the built environment that have now gained opportunity and access to this. I mean, these are some of your biggest property companies in South Africa. And now these young entrepreneurs have actually started getting into the system and gaining opportunities into this bigger system. What's beautiful, though, from a multiplication point, is that the vision was bigger than the company. Because it would have been easy to say, oh, this is growth points. And this is growth points that advantage, you know. We're getting our BE points looking great. We're getting wonderful young talent coming in. We're going to keep it to ourselves. But instead, the vision was actually about transforming an industry. And so what they did was they went from, and you can see there in the logos, it says the Growth Points Initiative and Property Coins, to now it says transforming the industry underneath it. And Growth Point has totally let go of his name on it, which is fascinating because that's a sacrifice. That's a brand sacrifice. It's a big brand sacrifice. But what came alongside that was they also started partnering with other competitors. So Attack, which was in the property industry, Redefine, which is a direct competitor of Growth Point, all started partnering with Property Point. And so they're all putting their BE spend into this vehicle, and they're all benefiting from this amazing incubator that sits in the middle. And the property industry is totally transforming. The face of the property industry in South Africa is looking different year on year. And so that's something, if you think about the Praxis model, that I sacrifice, we win. There is a big sacrifice that took place there for a sector to be transformed into a we win case. And then the last one, I think has more to do with culture. And so it's hard to speak about other people's cultures, so it would be great to talk about some of the other organizations that we have worked with. But I thought just to bring it back home and say, there's those things, there's smaller things. So those are really exciting examples, right? You know, changing lactose intolerance in Africa, awesome. Like shifting the whole built environment, that's amazing. And those are all possible. But what about just day-to-day stuff? So what about the way that we lead as leaders? And I started this conviction that was brewing for a couple of years, and I started actioning on it only at the beginning of this year, or maybe mid last year. But I love Praxis actually speaks about the fact that those with the most margin, so you're a leader, you have the most autonomy, you have the most margin in theory. Hold, again, or you don't. But we have the most margin and agency to be able to structure things in a way that we believe is redemptive. But we are the ones that often exploit ourselves. And that's why we don't have margin. And that's why we sometimes feel like we are being just thrown around with the waves. And what happens with us, if we exploit ourselves, is that we create norms that then get passed down to people that have less power in our organizations to dictate what is normal and what is possible. And so I started thinking a little bit around the positioning of work in my own mind. And so work shouldn't be transactional. I fully agree with that. You shouldn't just be rocking up to get a paycheck. It also shouldn't be ultimate. It shouldn't be the ultimate thing in my life. My entire identity and being shouldn't be shaped by the thing that I do. And that's hard, because we do it for so many hours in a day. It should be relational, and it should be purposeful. And if it is relational and purposeful, then we should care about more than just work. So again, I was sitting with the ladies in my council group this week actually, and about 4 out of the 5, let's go on this, were actually spoken about the fact that our lives have become very one-dimensional. It's like work and Sammy and work. And so it was just interesting to see how people that love the Lord, deeply desire to be redemptive, deeply desire to have balance, we're all struggling with this balance. We're all struggling with it, and somehow work just steals sort of the limelight the whole time. And how do we have time for other things? How do we have time for friends? How do we have time for hobbies? How do we have time for playing with our kids, enjoying time with our spouses? There's so much more, but we get pulled in and sucked in to the rhythms of work. And why? Do we sit and think about the why behind it? And so, one of the things that I want to be more intentional about, and I think I've always said I'm intentional about it, and I've always agreed to people's desire and said yes when people have asked, when they're wanting to prioritize family and other things. But over the last 12 months, I've been intentional myself to try and model it. And that's been hard. Where at a certain time, I closed my laptop. And that's, okay, confession, the last week has been special. I haven't done it. But I really tried hard this year to get home and be present with my son in the few hours that I have with him before he goes to bed. And then still working hard, not quite there yet, for my husband and I to have proper quality conversation before we go to bed. And have special time in the morning where we actually connect with one another before I start my day. And if I can't implement that, am I honestly prioritizing family? Am I honestly living what I was saying to my team about the fact that I care about the whole you? Or if I don't care about the whole me, but actually I only care about Keri and the success of Zawani, then surely I'm telling my whole team that that's what I'm actually expecting from them. I'm actually expecting my team to work day and night. I'm actually expecting my team to not prioritize anything else and drop everything at whenever, because this is the single most important thing in all of our lives. And I don't think that's God's intent. I think there's something about our leaning into God where we can actually trust Him for provision. We can trust Him for expanding our time horizons. And I say that not getting it right. Some days I get it right. Our operations manager is sitting here, so he can tell you how we're doing. But the last month, preparing for this talk has been the worst thing in the world for me. I've been so convicted. I always hear preachers say, our husband will preach on this, and this week I've really felt convicted on it, and God's really giving me challenge in that. My soul. This last month and a half have been ridiculous, and what it's actually resulted in is Keri starting to get grumpy, not be available, be short, not be in the detail, and my team's feeling it. I know it. I'm walking around like a bear with a sore head. I sat with my council group the other day and I said, I'm in a foul mood. But I just want to fight with everyone. And it's actually a result of my own choices. It's a result of boundaries I didn't put in place that I should have put in place, and now we're trying to fill it up. Complete stuff that we never planned and were meant to complete. And so my lack of discipline often overflows into the team. And so I encourage us as leaders, what are we doing to be at the coalface? What are we doing to actually be intentional in the way that we are building operations, that we are modeling the things that we truly say that are important, and that it's not, we're modeling it, but we're living by it. And last thing just to say is, my team, when I had middle management for a long season, was doing really well and was very efficient. There were niggles that I couldn't understand. And this year, when we spun out, and my middle management vanished for a little while, and it was actually so good for me because it's the first time I'll be back at the whole face, and it made sense. I was like, oh, our operations aren't aligning with our values. They're not actually aligning, and that's where the challenge is coming in. And it was so good for me to come back as a leader and part of that, because I know we enjoy the big vision and the big picture, but if we don't spend time and intentionally craft our time to come back into the detail and spend time in the operations where it's being embodied, then all sorts of crazy things start getting inculcated in our culture. And actually, our operations is the thing that drives our culture, that has unspoken norms or unspoken narratives about what our culture truly is. And so I end with this one line, that vision may inspire, but it's the daily grind that the gospel is truly seen.